Welcome. Welcome to the National Archives Know Your Records program. My name is Andrea Bassing-Matney, and we are broadcasting live from the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. Welcome. Before we begin, I have a few tips to share with you. For those of you who are here on site with us in the McGowan Theater, we will take your questions, but we ask that you hold them until the very end of the program and ask them in the aisle microphones so we can capture you online. For those of you who are watching online, you can also ask questions on this YouTube channel. Please first log into the chat section and type your questions in there, and I will ask the presenter your questions at the end of the program. You will also find on this webpage several hot links. One will take you to live captioning, another to the presentation slides, and several more to additional information about today's topic. So today's topic is hidden treasure, and it's on panoramic photos of the Alaska Territory. Hidden Treasure exhibit curator Richard Schneider provides a first-person account of how he created the Hidden Treasure exhibit at the National Archives at College Park. Schneider will discuss the records, history, context, and photographic techniques behind these extraordinary panoramic images. Now about our presenter, Richard Schneider. He started his career in 1992 as a photographic preservation specialist. When the Preservation Office moved from the National Archives in Washington, D.C., now known as Archives 1, to the building in College Park, Maryland, called Archives 2, Richard helped to outfit the new labs with equipment and create standard operating procedures. Richard later went on to supervise the photography section at Archives 2. He is still proud of the lab staff's achievements in preserving over 600,000 original negatives from Record Group 80, General Records of the Department of Navy. The staff also produced over 5,000 large format color transparencies of German war situation maps from World War II. And those are from Record Group 242, National Archives Collection of Foreign Records Seized. In addition, he has served as the coordinator for the National Archives Annual Preservation Conference, a photographer for National Archives events, contracting officers representative for underground record storage contracts, and helped to exhibit and beautify public spaces at the National Archives 1 and 2 buildings. Currently, he serves as the web content author for the preservation web pages on archives.gov. Richard earned his degree, his Master of Fine Arts in Photography from Rochester Institute of Technology, and his Bachelor of Science in Photography from Skidmore College in Saratoga Springs, New York. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our presenter, Richard Schneider.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's very nice to see you all here. It's a pleasure and a privilege to speak to you today. We are here for a Know Your Records presentation. I began this event today with a little song that helped me come up with an idea for a title for this presentation and the work that is on display at Archives 2. That was an album from the 70s called by the group Traffic, and a song called Hidden Treasure, and it seemed very appropriate based on the content of the materials that you're about to see today. A word about my organization. The goal of preservation programs is to ensure that records of our government will be appropriately preserved so that they will be available for use. We work with staff across the agency to support and promote preservation. You will find preservation program staff at work, preparing historic documents for display, rescuing burned military records, preserving electronic records, advising on design and storage of exhibition spaces, or protecting records in emergencies. We serve as a resource and offer guidance to NARA, the National Archives, in the DC region, as well as to federal record centers, field or regional archives, presidential libraries, and affiliated archives. Preservation programs includes the Conservation Lab, Research and Testing Lab, the St. Louis Preservation Division. It is an honor and a privilege to work with so many dedicated professionals. But we're not here today to talk about great albums from the 1970s. We're here to talk about something entirely different. First and foremost, Hidden Treasure is a display of photographs, framed reproductions, that is on display at Archives 2. These are reproductions of original panoramic photographs, original maps of Alaska, and information panels. It can also mean quite a number of other things too. Hidden Treasure refers to the natural resources that lay beneath the surface of Alaska's vast landscape. Hidden Treasure is the beauty of Alaska as captured on film by the U.S. Geological Survey, which I will call the survey from here on in, but after its original purpose had been fulfilled, remained unseen and in storage for many decades. The panoramic photographs in Hidden Treasure were but one step in the creation of mass-produced topographic maps, the final product. The fact that supporting materials like these were kept at all, I think, is remarkable. The true purpose of the photographs was discovered, like Hidden Treasure, only after the preservation lab work at NARA had been completed. Photographs were made for a specific purpose, data gathering, but that was not known at the time the duplication lab work was being taken. While many pictures had inherent beauty, their purpose was not aesthetic. Panoramas were also on nitrate-based film, the earliest form of flexible film, as opposed to rigid metal or glass plates. Nitrate film required special handling and storage over time. Nitrate had the potential to combust under perfect storm conditions resulting from a poor storage environment. Hidden Treasure is the discovery that mixed in with the data capture photographs were what I would call aesthetic gems that captured work life in the Alaskan wilderness, photography and surveying techniques, and many noteworthy towns and geological formations. The panoramas could be divided into two basic types: data gathering and memento or souvenir or whatever have you, test photographs. The data gathering ones would be printed, analyzed, and used for the creation of maps. The souvenir, memento, or test photo panoramas were taken to ensure that the camera, the processing chemicals, and other factors related to film exposure were in check. It so happens that on occasion, these test photos were of camp life, cities and towns, and other scenes that the topographer or his team wished to remember. Absent the knowledge of why these photos were taken in the first place, I was drawn to the photos that contained the human factor. What was it like to be in the wilds of Alaska with but a few coworkers and a pack of horses? I could imagine myself being among them. That was the connection that was formed. Hidden Treasure was the surprise in finding that many of the single-shot panoramas could be digitally combined into much longer panoramas. In most cases, these panoramas had never before been seamlessly assembled. All of the individual negatives were about 5 to 6 inches in height by 11 to 12 inches long. All of the prints produced at the time were contact printed and therefore the same size. I'll talk about this more later. In order for a longer panorama to be recognized as such, combining two or more negatives, there would have needed to be some overlap between one negative and the next. I might have seen a mountain peak on the right-hand side of a negative that perfectly matched up with the same peak on the left-hand side of a different negative. By digitally combining the negatives and removing the areas that overlapped, a seamless panorama was created. It is not known how many panoramas connected in this fashion. The only place where a very small number of long, seamless panoramas were reproduced was in Bulletin 657, and I'll discuss that more later. Hidden Treasure is also the significant contributions made by James W. Bagley to the fields of panoramic and aerial photography for topographic surveying. It should be noticed that most of the content and intellectual foundation for Hidden Treasure was contained within the U.S. Geological Survey Bulletin 657, authored by James W. Bagley. The title was The Use of the Panoramic Camera in Topographic Surveying, published, as it so happens, in 1917, 100 years ago. It was also 100 years ago that Mr. Bagley enlisted in the U.S. Army as it ramped up its presence in the Great War, went to France, and further developed aerial photography for use in wartime mapping. Hidden treasure are the records uncovered at the National Archives and Records Administration that relate to and enhance the experience of seeing these panoramas. This was among the most interesting and rewarding part of the project, connecting the records of the U.S. Geological Survey with other records in other formats within the holdings of NARA. They come together to present a narrative. Truth be told, I was so wrapped up in getting Hidden Treasure finished up that I was oblivious to the other milestone occurring in 2017, the 150th anniversary of the Alaska Purchase. A little bit of serendipity going on here. 2017 was also my 25th anniversary with NARA. Hidden Treasure is a display of photographs, like I said before, and I'll say again, a display of photographs and cartographic records from NARA and other sources now on display at Archives 2. The display is a synthesis of many of my personal interests: maps, Alaska, panoramic photography, travel, and historical research. I wanted to take a moment to offer thanks and acknowledgement to Ann Seibert and Gail Bentley, without whom this display would have never been possible. Sadly, they retired from NARA last year. Maybe sad for us, they're probably fine for them. I also wanted to acknowledge Nick Nathanson from the Still Pictures Holdings Unit, Sarah Spargel from Conservation, Jeff Reed, who got me involved in this project in the first place, the structure shop of the facilities contractor LB&B, who hung the display and performed a lot of shop work with the frames and acrylic sheeting, Jenny Stevens with the photography library at the U.S. Geological Facility in Denver, Colorado, and of course I wish to acknowledge Andrea Matney and the whole Know Your Records program, as well as the audio-video staff of the McGowan Theater. Thank you. Hidden Treasure, I'm going to do some background information here. Hidden Treasure is located at the National Archives at College Park, Maryland. It is open to the public during research room hours, 9 to 5 p.m. Monday through Saturday, with the exception of federal holidays. It is in a public space that requires no special access or accompaniment by NARA staff. This facility is not on the beaten path if you are museum hopping in the DC-Baltimore region. However, if you make the effort, I think you will reap the rewards. Public displays of historic panoramic photographs are not all that common. And I just wanted to let you see, for those that are not familiar with the facility, that this is after you've gone through the security checkpoint. You will go down the stairs over here to the, wrong one, to the left here, and then you'll go down the stairs and the display will be to the right. If you choose to use the elevator, there is a one-level elevator also right there past the security checkpoint. So this is a glimpse at the display itself. Altogether, Hidden Treasure has 42 framed reproductions of panoramas, 5 reproductions of maps and plans, and 12 informational panels that contain panoramas within the layout. The only original item on display is Bulletin 657 by James Bagley. The panoramas are about 10 times the size of the original if it had been contact printed. I chose the larger size in order to better fill this large display space. I'm going to offer, lots of people sometimes have technical questions for me, so I'm going to give it to you right now. And this is not a product endorsement, this is simply what I used to create this. The scans were made on an Epson XL 10000. Image processing was in Photoshop CS 5.5, an older version of it, and the computer itself was a 2009 vintage G5 Macintosh. Printed on Somerset 100% rag paper with the Epson 9800 stylus printer. Frame prints were cold mounted onto Coda acid-free foam board and also 1-inch Gator foam. Prints have captions directly printed on them. There are no mats in this. If you are downloading any of the image files from the National Archives catalog, you will get the image minus the caption. Please note that the display does contain a few images from other sources, such as the USGS Photo Library and the Library of Congress, These images will not be available on the NARA website for downloading. So, if you go to this space at Archives 2, you will see that the location looks a little familiar. That's because previous to the hidden treasure was another panoramic photography exhibit called the Long View. It was on display from 1998 to 2001 and from 2005 to 2016. And this gives you a couple of glimpses of the Long View. It presented a broad selection of panoramas from the still picture holdings on all sorts of subjects. Most were shot between 1910 and 1930. The exhibit served as an introduction to panoramic photography and featured work taken with a few different types of panoramic cameras. Connections were made between still picture records and other records and different formats in NARA's holdings. And here's another shot of that. Most of the images were, if anything, if the camera name circuit camera means anything to you, most of the images in the Long View were taken with that type of camera. So here we go back to the beginning as far as my experience goes with this project. In the lab. The labs, when I speak of the labs, these are the photo and duplication labs. They were part of preservation programs at the time, which was 2008, and they are now part of the Office of Innovation. The U.S. Geological Survey film records were received by NARA in 2007 under the normal records transfer process. There were 52,000 in all, and 6,000 of these were panoramas. Our job, actually Jeff and his crew's job in the preservation lab was to produce high-quality duplicates of the original materials. These records were on nitrate-based film and would need a special limited exception to be kept within our building at College Park. They were carefully stored in a 38-degree walk-in refrigerated room. Negatives themselves were kept in boxes, which were then kept in fireproof cabinets. Precautions were necessary and required, and staff members were never in any danger from handling or duplicating these negatives. In fact, upon examination, most of the originals were in surprisingly good condition. All accession, just as a background, all accession materials from the U.S. Geological Survey are part of Record Group 57, Records of the U.S. Geological Survey. Excuse me. 4x5s and 5x7s made up the bulk. That's the box at the top there, made up the bulk of the materials. They were likely of places in the continental U.S. I didn't look at these closely. I was only interested in panoramas. Once Jeff got me involved in the project, those were the only parts that I was interested in. I simply didn't have the time to examine everything. This shows you some of the conditions that the records were in upon receipt. There was a holdings maintenance program that had begun in Denver, and it involved organizing and better taking care of the negatives, as you can see in the top right. Unfortunately, some of the other ones were still in a bundled fashion like you see on the bottom. Sometimes all the information that we had regarding these images was written on cardboard. Bundled negatives may have been the most vulnerable to deterioration or damage from external sources. And you see at the top here, inside of these plastic containers would have been some information that was documented in the location there in Denver. My initial job in the project was to examine the original negatives and check for viability for duplication. Hundreds of negatives suffered from water damage and possibly film deterioration. Many were unable to be duplicated because they were simply stuck together. Water damage caused paper from the sleeve to adhere to the emulsion layer of the film, as you can see in the top left there. You can see that the paper has simply come off and embedded itself within the negative. Water damage is also responsible for much of the other problems that we saw. Brittleness, as you can see on the bottom, is a sign of a chemical breakdown of the nitrate film base. And you can see in that particular image that part of the top, a chunk has fallen off. My job at the beginning would be to orient the pictures so that the sky would be at the top and the emulsion would all be facing the same way. If I saw anything interesting from the viewpoint of a photographer, I would quickly scan it. I had no idea at the time what the final product would be from these scans. As we know, it's this display hidden treasure. Scanning was not part of the project's scope, so I only did it when time permitted. Other signs of deterioration or damage, as you can see in this particular slide, mirroring at the top, you can see how it's become a very shiny, glossy surface at the top there, and a hardened ripple pattern in the lower image. This made it difficult to evenly focus it when scanning. This is the ancient roll film contact printer that we use to make duplicates. The light source is on the bottom where you see all these switches, and then you see a glass plate down there. And there's an air-filled bladder on the top. When the original negative and duplicating film were positioned correctly, you would manually pull the bladder down on top of the film and then make a 1 to 3 second exposure. The safe light would be on during this process. It used orthochromatic duplicating film. The film itself was 10 inches wide by 500 feet long. And as you know from before, the original nitrate film was in sheet form. Fortunately, we did this in the darkroom with a safe light on, but it was all manual. Positioning the negative onto the glass was manual, advancing the film was manual, and took a little bit of dexterity for sure. Sometimes it was difficult to keep the negatives perfectly straight. The duplicates were processed in the old standby Kodak Versamat processor. These were terrific processors and got the job done, that's for sure. This is what the final product is today from a preservation standpoint. All of the panoramas were preserved using this aerial duplicating film. Smaller formats were preserved or reformatted as interpositives onto 100-foot long rolls of 70 millimeter wide panchromatic film. All of these are presently in the still picture stack area at Archives 2. The preserved panorama film duplicates are still on these long rolls, as you can see here. This is what it would look like if you were to use an aerial film reader to look at them. You've got the feed, you've got the take-up, and you've got the light source right there. Access is the next stage in the process. New digital files would be made from these duplicates. So here we go. Let's go, now that we've got the lab work out of the way, let's go and see a match made in Alaska. Most topographic readings and measurements in the continental or lower 48 US were taken using an alidade, which is a precision telescopic device, and a plane table, and you see those pictures right in the upper left there. The topographer would hand draw what he saw through the lens onto paper or celluloid that was attached to the table. This meant longer times in the field, but less time in an office setting. Most important to know, and I'll probably repeat this a couple of times, the panoramic photographs and the handmade drawings using the alidade and plane table were used for the purpose of creating topographic maps. The panoramas were not a finished product in and of themselves. One step in the process, that's it. It's not known if the drawings are still in existence. It would be interesting to find out, that's for sure. I think it's very fortunate that the panoramas were saved in the first place, because again, they're one step in the process. Here's a Know Your Records tidbit. This is a map of Alaska from 1904, a record group 49, records of the Bureau of Land Management. The vastness of Alaska made the sole use of the hand-drawn method impractical. James Bagley proved that panoramic photography could provide the information needed for map creation. Less time would be spent in the field and more territory covered, and although on the flip side, more time would be needed in the office for analysis and interpretation. I threw this in there just to give you a sense of how large Alaska is compared to the lower 48. However, it should be known that the only part that was really surveyed using the panoramic photography and the alidade and plane table were like the central to south central. They weren't going way up to the north or far west to the Aleutian Islands. What this graph that I pulled offline shows you is it's meant to illustrate the short window of opportunity that they had in order to take these photographs, which was basically the summertime. Any other time of year, they could be snowed in, iced in, the weather could be bad, and it would be pointless to have an excursion team out there. So when you're looking at Alaska surveying and Alaska photography, you're looking at all photographs taken June, July, and August, basically. This is a picture of James W. Bagley himself, shortly after he enlisted in the U.S. Army. I'm wondering aloud perhaps that there are military records on Mr. Bagley that are waiting to be discovered at NARA. Bagley perfected a photographic system that had been experimented with several years earlier, but then abandoned. And what I have here to the right is the actual panoramic camera used in the field by the topographers. Here is a comparison of the U.S. Geological Survey camera and a mass-produced camera called the Alvista. And I think just looking at them, you can see that there are similarities. Both are called swing lens cameras. And what that means is that the lens is in the center of the camera, and during the exposure, the lens pivots on an axis from one side to the other, exposing a sheet of film, or a roll of film, I should say, that is curved at the back of the camera. The Alvista was designed for the serious hobbyist and perhaps a professional. Several models were made based on the width of the film used. I believe they got as large as a 7-inch, which meant that it took 7-inch wide film, and shortly you'll see one of the smaller ones, a little demonstration of it. But this shows you a couple of the advertising elements that you would see for the Alvista. The camera used flexible film, like I said before, that got 4 shots per roll. This is a top view of an Alvista camera. This is taken originally from the patent that was submitted back in 1904. The application itself was actually submitted in 1898. It shows the lens in the middle right here. It shows the feed and the take-up reel, and it shows that the film is in an arc. It isn't flat against the back of the camera, it's in an arc. And behind the lens is like a cone-shaped, a flat cone-shaped piece that exposes the film a little bit at a time through what is called a slit. The film isn't exposed all at once, it is exposed quickly but gradually as the camera pivots from one side to the next. Here, let's see, I hope this works. Here is a basic operation of an Alvista camera, courtesy of Jamie Young. So he's going to turn the camera on. You see the exposure being made, and you see the fan at the bottom, which keeps the motion even. Okay. Now he's going to take off the fan, and he's going to put a different sized fan on it, and that will change the exposure to a faster one. So he winds it again, does the exposure, and you can see that this exposure was a lot quicker. So that's basically how an Alvista camera works. This shows you a shot as the film would see it. So here's the camera being tripped, the shutter, and you'll see in a second here how the light hits the film little by little through the slit. Okay. That's all for that one there. One of the methods that they used for very difficult places to access was to position 2 panoramic cameras at the bow of a ship, or a boat, I should say, and these would be used to photograph areas that were very difficult to access. The whole concept of a swing lens camera didn't only survive or get practiced in the early part of the 20th century. This here is a late 20th century swing lens camera called a wide lux. It used 35 millimeter film. Wide lux was used by many. I've used a wide lux before. It is said that actor Jeff Bridges was very fond of wide luxes. They were produced from the 1970s till the 2000s. The next type of camera, a more modern type of design, was a Noblex, also a swing lens camera. You could see in the center there the opening where the light would enter the camera. I chose this because it was difficult to find shots of photographers actually working in the field with the camera. This here is a negative, and it shows the photographer on the side with the tripod and the camera right there about to take a picture. So here we go. With most of the photography or the topographic effort of the early 20th century was focused on south central Alaska. And these are a closer up shot of that. Areas where panoramas and alidade readings occurred were identified as districts. This region of Alaska held the most interest for industry and commerce in the early 20th century. So if you were to see a collection of the negatives, they would start off with Ruby District or Bonnyfield District or Port Valdez District, which was really probably the most beautiful of all. Within a district, stations, if you can see here, their red circles would be identified by an advance party as being the best places for photography and other methods of measurement. The red parts would be trails, and the circles would be places where they would consider taking photographs. When looking through the panoramas and then comparing them with maps of the era, it made it enjoyable to try and figure out where the panoramas were taken from. This is actually the same location as the previous slide, but in this particular slide, it shows what the angle of view was desired from the station. Chances are that these here were one or more possible exposures. So if you see, for instance, if you can read station 68, you see this big V type of shape, that would be probably 2 shots in order to get that angle of view. 360-degree panoramas were not all that common, but they were found, and making these discoveries were really quite enjoyable. Right now, what you're looking at is a scan of an original negative on the top. I inverted the image on the bottom as the original print would have been. Data gathering panoramas here were usually guilty of violating the rule of thirds, meaning that oftentimes the image was divided up equally, sky and ground. These are a little better, but and anyway, if you were taking a photography class, they would be telling you don't divide up the sky evenly between sky and ground. However, this is what the data gathering called for. My interest in the panoramas were from the point of view of a fine arts photographer, not a topographer. This here is a panoramic photo alidade. The use of this piece of equipment was almost like being there in person, as if the scene had been scooped up and delivered to Washington, D.C. Everything had to be exact. The lens used for taking the picture, the lens used for viewing the print, etc. If you were looking at this print through the magnifying lens, it was as if you would be looking at a scene using the alidade. It was meant to mimic it. It was meant to capture that image so that it could be analyzed in DC in an office setting. It isn't just a matter of viewing the pictures that helped with the map making. There was a tremendous amount of mathematics, and I am not here to tell you how they all figured it out. Thank you very much. Even though I did do better in the math and the English section of the SATs, they used a tremendous amount of geometry, trigonometry, and so forth to turn the data, the visual data from the photograph, into something that could be used in a map-making process. Here are a couple of other tools that were used in that process: the rotary scale at the bottom and an elevation computer at the top. All were designed to determine the height of mountain peaks and other formations in the panorama. The markings and measurements were added to the original print in an office setting. It should be noted, that no evidence was found that showed an interest or purpose in combining the original prints into longer panoramas. All the original prints were the same size, and I'll show you this a little later. So what you're looking at the top is what the scan from the original negative was like, and at the bottom, hopefully you can see some of the documentation that has been written on, and these are the numbers that would be used in the map-making process. I've got other examples that show a tremendous number of readings and numbers and lines sticking out. They would do that back home. Measurements and mathematical equations were used to determine the height of mountain peaks and other geological formations. And again, we've got all this mathematics going on here. And I wish a topographer from the USGS were here. That would probably be good material for another lecture. So, but in the end, what they would create are these maps. So what you're looking at here is what it looks like in real life, and this is what it looks like as a map. This is the College Fjord in south central Alaska. It was part of the Port Valdez district. It was named that way because several of the glaciers that are feeding into the water here were named after Ivy League schools. So you see Vassar, Wellesley, Bryn Mawr, Harvard, Yale, etc. So extended panoramas. I mentioned earlier about the combination of 2 or more images to form a long panorama. That's why I say more than meets the eye. Again, all original panoramas were in sheet form like you see here. Most were kept in bundles of 100 or more. Often just the photographer's names, dates, and district were written. Images were selected for scanning by me. The ones that I found interesting were chosen only for what I considered their artistic merit or interesting subject matter. As I said before, towns, camp life, etc. Can you imagine yourself here? After scanning the individual sheets, it was seen that overlapping occurred in some of them, and I'm going to demonstrate a little bit how that worked in the lab setting. So right here you have 2 scans of the College Fjord. Using Photoshop, it was easy to overlap the images to see exactly how they matched up. As you can see here, sometimes the exposures were not exactly the same. There may have been some fogging of the negative during handling or processing. Other times, the topographer would move the camera slightly from one exposure to the next, resulting in images that came close but did not exactly match up. There are a couple of examples of this in Hidden Treasure. As you can see, some panoramas were very well suited for overlapping and were interchangeable. So you can see how one worked there and the other there, and look at that. It looks like it matches up perfectly. I decided not to use photo merge in Photoshop, which is a tool used for creating panoramas or similar stitching software. For me, it did not produce satisfactory results, in my opinion, because it didn't deal well with uneven exposures, like you see here at the end, or mismatches due to contraction or warping of the original. Therefore, all assembling of the panoramas were done manually using Photoshop tools such as rubber stamp, eraser, cropping, warp, and distort. And if you work in Photoshop, you know what I'm talking about. Once things matched up correctly and I flattened the image, I made the panorama look its best without changing its information content. Hidden Treasure is the first time the combined, seamless panoramas have been seen by the public, except for the handful that were reproduced in Bulletin 657. Personally, I would love to come here and photograph what it looks like now. I'm thinking of starting a GoFundMe page. If anyone can help me with that, that would be terrific. College Fjord, as pictured here, is a favorite spot for cruise ships, and I'll talk about that in a little while as well. Life in the frontier, no breakfast buffet or hot tub. Bummer. One thing, U.S. Geological Survey staff volunteered for the Alaska projects. The topographic engineer was the team leader. All materials for the summer journey were brought with them, from clothes to photographic supplies to food. It was not deemed practical or efficient use of time to have staff forage or hunt for their food. So they brought everything with them. Film, chemistry, clothes, you name it. Detergent, they had it all cataloged and brought with them on the journey up. Even though pictures like these were not used for data gathering, they deeply connected me with the adventure these men were experiencing. I was in scouting and had always enjoyed being in the outdoors. but Alaska is far different than the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. These pictures tell a story. They humanize and personalize what may have been a grueling and often tedious job, thousands of miles from home. It speaks volume to their dedication and service to America. It really pays to know these records. The staff were not only responsible for themselves, but for the pack horses that carried all their supplies, tents and food. I assume that these horses ate whatever was available to them. I don't think they brought hay with them. I'm sure they managed just fine. But one thing I like to kid about is that these topographers were given lots of duties which would fall under the umbrella of other duties as assigned in their performance plans. I'm sure we would all be interested in that as well. I would love to have horse care be included in my performance plan. I wanted to take a moment to show you a couple of familiar places that were contained within these records. Here we have a couple of towns. The top one is Kodiak, Alaska, and the bottom is Ketchikan, Alaska. No readings were taken from these pictures. They were most likely taken for souvenir or test purposes. Ketchikan on the bottom is often the first port of call in Alaska if one is on a cruise ship or a ferry. And I will be bringing up shortly the fact that I have a history on cruise ships. My job in the mid to late 80s was as a photographer on cruise ships, and that creates a personal connection between myself and Alaska. Alaska was our summer season, and I've been there perhaps about 60 times, 5 seasons worth of trips, 15 or 16 trips per season. So I'm very familiar with some of these places like Ketchikan, Juneau, Sitka, Skagway, etc. One thing, a little story about Ketchikan. At the very far left of this picture is a mountain called Deer Mountain. It was a busy port for us, Ketchikan, and I didn't have a lot of time available to do exploring, but one day I did, and one day I decided to hike to the top of Deer Mountain. Well, I'll tell you, Deer Mountain was infested with 6-legged marauders that completely ruined my experience, I tell you. It was so awful that I couldn't even take any pictures when I got to the top. Therefore, when I got to the bottom, I petitioned the town council to rename it Biting Insect Mountain, but they didn't go for that. Anyway, this here is Bulletin 657, published by the U.S. Geological Survey. Within the National Archives, it is in Record Group 287, Publications of the U.S. Government. There are PDF reproductions of this available on the USGS website. In fact, many publications, circulars, and bulletins are available as downloadable PDFs on USGS, and it's a tremendous resource. Bulletin 657 is the only place prior to Hidden Treasure where you could see panoramas joined together seamlessly. Only a dozen or less reproduced in the publication. This pair shows the results of the dual camera system used on the steamboat, the Pathfinder. So that shows you how the dual cameras were set up at the bow of the ship, and they overlap their images, producing these seamless panoramas of glaciers reaching the water's edge there. The bulletin also showed how the photograph connected to the map itself. So in this case, you've got the photograph taken from Station 25, and then on the top part here, you see where Station 25 was located. And I love connecting the dots in this fashion. It made it for a very, very enjoyable experience. And once again, I wanted to reiterate that there was a tremendous amount of math that went into creating these maps, and Mr. Bagley gave them all to us in tremendous detail. This here is a modern aerial shot showing what the College Fjord looks like today. As James Bagley wound up his detailed description on how to use panoramic photography for map making, he was already looking beyond to a photographic process that could be even quicker, more detailed, less expensive, and more efficient for map making, and that would be aerial photography. The last chapter of Bulletin 657 deals with the use of aerial photography, which was still in its infancy, of course, in 1917, for topographic mapping. By the time the bulletin was published, Bagley was headed to France with the U.S. Army participating in the Great War. Aerial photography would be a tremendous benefit for the Allied effort. Other Geological Survey topographers would carry on panoramic photography in Alaska until 1932. Now I have a couple of shots here of what things look like now versus what things looked like then. This is a modern Google Maps satellite view of the Shaup Glacier and Mount Shasta. The Shaup Glacier is over here, and Mount Shasta is over here where I'm circling. These maps would be interesting and useful to compare how things are now versus back then and come up with data and research accordingly. This is the same basic spot as the photograph, and it shows how far down the glacier was in the 19-teens versus today. I would say that the glacier was probably around here in 1910 or so. Also on this picture, you can see approximately where a couple of pictures from the show were taken. I'm circling around this right here. This was a station where Mount Shasta was in the picture. And over here, if you can see where I'm photographed or circling, that is another location where these following two pictures may have been taken. So the bottom picture would be the shot of Mount Shasta, followed by the Valdez Narrows and the Shaup Glacier, and the top one of the topographers right there in the field, taking measurements in the snow. That's quite amazing when you think about it. So there you go. You see, you can approximate where the pictures were taken, like there, and then you can see them in real life. I enjoyed, one of the things I really enjoyed about the project was trying to find where these places were. And if I had any clue whatsoever, I would go online and start looking around and verifying what people might have told me through chat rooms and so forth. So in this case, this is the Barry and the Cascade Glacier. This is what it looks like from the 19-teens. This is what it looks like today. And I have a closer up view, and that gives you an idea of a more modern picture. Doesn't look like the Cascade and the Barry glaciers are doing all that badly. So that's good to know. Now we're going to a personal recollection. Oh my God, what is this? Here are a couple of pictures of me. Now, why would I include pictures of me in this presentation? Well, I wanted to give you a connection between myself and Alaska. As I said before, I worked on cruise ships. My first experience in Alaska was on, yes, you guessed it, the Love Boat. The original Love Boat from the TV series was the Sun Princess, and that's one that I worked on for a while. The top picture in black and white is the Mendenhall Glacier outside of Juneau, and that was in 1985. And the bottom picture was taken in the Glacier Bay National Monument in around 1988. One thing that I should say, and this is kind of off topic, but the top picture in black and white is actually a color print, a color negative. And while I was scanning the original color negative, I found that it suffered terribly from deterioration and dye shifting, and it became such that I couldn't possibly reproduce it in color. I had to desaturate all the color out of it, turn it into a black and white image. Otherwise, I would have had a green sky and a red glacier, and it was just quite awful. So those of you that have any interest and any commitment to preserving your family history, get on it, because especially color can fade and do awful things, and then your history is potentially lost. Another tidbit about the bottom picture is that sometimes I would get into a lifeboat with some of the officers and crew in Glacier Bay, and we would retrieve an iceberg, a small iceberg. We'd get it into a net, bring it back to the ship. It would be hoisted into the Lido deck. People would chip off chunks of it and put it in drinks. What a great idea. They would serve some kind of drink that had glacial ice in it. And the one thing interesting about glacial ice is that because it's so dense, it doesn't melt very quickly. Not at all. It's really fascinating stuff. This here is a shot of the materials, the original prints in the photographic library at the survey facility in Denver, Colorado. The original prints are in very good condition and protected against anything potentially harmful. They were all contact printed and about the same size and dimensions. These records were seen and examined on a site visit that my wife and I took in 2012. This here is a print that actually found its way into Hidden Treasure. These are not my hands, just in case you were wondering. I hope that these gentlemen that were in the picture got to see these. That's one thing I was thinking about. Did they ever get to see the candid shots? Yes, they would have seen the data gathering shots, but did they save and maybe print some of these candid shots for themselves? And here you have the print that's in Hidden Treasure. I think it was very cool to be able to find the original print in Denver and then reproduce it in the lower left there in Hidden Treasure. So a little bit about James Bagley, legacy and further research. He was a tremendously important person for the field of aerial photography and topography, and there's a lot of information to be found about Mr. Bagley online. This one happens to be his marriage certificate, and I think it's just very cool to see this, that he had gotten married in 1911 in Seattle. So I can assume that he got married in October, so that would have been after the summer photography season was over and he was headed back, and the family came to the Northwest from Tennessee, and he got married there, and it's all part of his interesting background. This is Mr. Bagley. Many organizations celebrate and highlight Bagley's contributions to aerial photography and mapping. This here is from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. In fact, there is a plaque at the Fort Belvoir Army Geospatial Center in honor of James Bagley, and you see his entry there at the bottom of the page. Other source material, it can be found here and there. One thing I wanted to stress is that the difference between some of this material and what you find at the National Archives is that the National Archives has a great deal of original source material, the original photographs, the original documents. It's what makes the National Archives so very special for researchers. After Bagley left the Army as a lieutenant colonel in 1936. He took on a position as a lecturer at Harvard University, and he was in something called the Institute of Geographical Exploration. Now, isn't that something that you would like to be a part of? That just sounds like the coolest place. I'd want to major in that, really. This was his major magnum opus publication, published in 1941 while he was at Harvard, Aerophotography and Aero Surveying, published in 1941. James Bagley taught at Harvard for somewhere between 8 and 10 years, and for further research, I hadn't checked out the Harvard archives, but there's probably a lot of material on him there. Other material that I found about Mr. Bagley, this is his application for a headstone. This is the end of his life. It shows his birth date, the day he died. He was born in Fayetteville, Tennessee, and is buried there. All very interesting part of his personal history. Bagley's legacy lives on. The Bagley Ice Field in south central Alaska was named in his honor, and you can see that right here. When it comes to further research, there's plenty that can be done at the National Archives. Bagley was a lieutenant colonel in the 29th Engineer Regiment in the mid-1930s. And if you see this circle at the bottom here, you'll see that there's a record group. I believe it's 381 or 391, the records of the engineers. And there is, in fact, textual records relating to the 29th Engineer Regiment from 1919 to 1939. So it's very possible that material on Mr. Bagley is in our holdings and waiting to be discovered. Perhaps some hidden treasure is waiting to be discovered in these albums. These are a true treasure that we have at the National Archives in the Still Picture Division. These are group photographs taken by Eugene Goldbeck from between 1935 and 1938 of virtually every U.S. and foreign-based Army unit. Bagley may have been at Wright Field in Ohio at this time, and so I'm just going to have to go through sometime and look for Mr. Bagley in these albums. Mr. Bagley had a distinctive pose when he took photographs. So there's always one hand on a hip. So if I look through a group of men and I see a guy like this, chances are it's Mr. Bagley. There are other still picture panoramas that deserve a look-see. There was a photographer from Montgomery, Alabama named Paul Richards who took photographs of Army units in France during World War I. It's possible that Bagley might be in one of those photographs. In closing, it was a privilege to have gotten to know some of the records from RG 57. They have meaning for me. They capture moments I can relate to, and these records matter. The same experience is possible for each and every one of you within a multitude of record groups in our holdings. Visit the National Archives, either in person or online. Have time and patience, and discover your own hidden treasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I appreciate your talk and sharing your own experience. If anybody has any questions for our presenter, Richard Schneider, if you're here in the room with us, please make your way over to the microphone in the aisle so that we can capture you on video and online. And I'll start out with the first question. You've mentioned orthochromatic film.
Yes.
What is orthochromatic film?
It's
Sounds
simply a type of film that does not see, if you want to call it that, I'm being a little simplistic here, but it does not see all the wavelengths of visible light. It does not see reddish orange wavelengths. So therefore, you can use it in a darkroom setting. You can use it with a safe light on in a darkroom. And that was very important because we had a manual method for making the duplicates. We had to see where the originals were going on the glass, and we had to see how much we were advancing the film. If it had been pitch black, if it had been panchromatic film, pan meaning all visible wavelengths, we would have had to be in total darkness, and we would have never been able to see what we were doing. So with the orthochromatic film, with the film that could be used in a safe light setting, we could see what we were doing, basically. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. It looks like we have a question in the audience.
Yes,
okay.
sir.
Thank you.
Hi. Two questions / remarks. First off, I remember reading a long time ago an interview with John Wayne, and they were talking about the way he received the interviewer, and they were saying he was on his yacht and all these trappings of great wealth were there, including ice for his drinks that was shaved from a glacier at that point. And you said it lasts longer. Is this just another thing is this kind of popular among the idle rich and the oligarchs of their society today?
Well, I truly do not know. I know that from a physical chemistry point of view, glacial ice is just very condensed. And because it's very condensed, it just simply takes longer to melt. And therefore, it was just a treat. When we were in Glacier Bay, it was just a treat. It was something to add some interest to the crews, that they would retrieve these little icebergs. And I tell you, those icebergs would still be pretty much intact once we got back to Vancouver several days later. And they'd have to pitch them overboard or something. I don't know what they did with them, but I think I've heard accounts of how melted glacial ice, I'm sure some entrepreneur has turned that into a niche, an organic enterprise as far as drinking water goes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. One more quick remark / question in that I'm from Detroit, and one of the arterial streets in the downtown area is called Bagley Avenue. And I'm wondering, since I lived on Seward Street, if
Well, I
there's
don't know
anything
if,
into that.
It's not an uncommon name. I think, I don't know of any connection Mr. Bagley had with Detroit. He was at the Wright airfield in Ohio. That's where he did a lot of his work after he came back from World War I. And he was from Tennessee and lived most likely in Cambridge or Boston later on in his life. So I'm not sure if there's a connection there, but I did work on Ancestry to try and find living relatives of Mr. Bagley, and I have come up empty so far. I think that some of his children didn't live past their 60s or 70s, and so it's still a work in progress trying to find relatives, but I don't know of any connection yet to Detroit, but thank you for your
Thanks
question.
very much.
Of course.
Do we have any more questions online or on site? No? Okay, let me make my way up here so I'm not a disembodied voice. I want to thank everyone, especially Mr. Schneider, for providing this presentation for us today. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
And I'd also like to add that we have recorded this on YouTube, and you can find the presentation slides here on the webpage, and it will stay up forevermore. So we hope to see you again for future Know Your Records program. Thank you so much for coming today.